Hi everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I know it's been a while, and as you can see around me, I've got a new setup. So we're currently at my home where I now have my own recording setup so I can record whenever I want, which means we're going to have a lot more educational and sit down breakdown videos coming your way, hopefully in the near future, and this is the first one. So what I wanted to discuss today was my thought process behind appraising sites. So not necessarily how to run an appraisal, but how I come to my residual land value and therefore the number that I would want to offer to a landowner, and generally what's going on in my head when we're going through that process, because that's something I get asked probably the most out of all of the questions I ever get on like Instagram DMs and Q&As and things like that. How do I come up with land values? How do I value land? So I thought today I would just sit down and run through that with you. So in front of us here, I've got a example appraisal. So this is just an appraisal I've made up. Essentially, it's a site for 6 houses. So the numbers behind it are 3 house types, 1 of the large house type, 2 of the middle one, and then I've gone 3 of the smallest house type, being 1,800 square feet. We're in an area where the average price per square foot sits around £400 a square foot. Now, obviously, if this was an appraisal I'd done, I would have sat on Rightmove for a while, probably with Tyler's help, coming up with comparables to help us value these units. So the assumption with this appraisal is that obviously I've gone through that process, but that's not the focus of today's video. So one thing you will notice is that as the house types get smaller, they get slightly higher in the price per square foot, which is quite common. We tend to see that the bigger the house type, you start hitting a point of diminishing returns, whereby you don't achieve the exact same price per square foot. So that's why we have it ever so slightly increasing as we get to the smaller house types. And across our 6 units, we have a total site gross development value of 5.25 million. So the next section of our appraisal, as I'm sure you're all aware, is the planning cost. So this is a site, or our made up site is a site that hasn't got planning, so we need to take it through the planning process. So I've got planning costs of nearly £50,000 here, and that is made up of reports, planning fees, and obviously our architect's fees. So we've got topographical report, ground investigation, arboricultural survey, ecology survey. Personally, when I do an appraisal, and this is again just sort of thought process for me, you'll see here that I've got, for example, bat survey, noise survey, and air quality all blank. Now this is because in my mind, this is a site that didn't need these particular surveys. I may have even included things like, for example, a flood risk assessment. The reason I include or I show them titled but put them as nil is because personally, if a bank ever sees my appraisals, I quite often leave things blank, because what it shows is that I've considered that element and it's not necessary, rather than I've neglected to think about the need for a bat survey. I've concluded that the site, doesn't sit near any barns with open eaves or woodlands, so it doesn't require a bat survey. So I've kept it nil, because that's sort of my thought process, is perhaps that gives the banks comfort to see, that I've considered something and not included it. Moving down, transport consultant, traffic survey, searches, planning fee. Now the planning fee, you'll notice that's the most sort of accurate to the pound, and the reason is I use a document that I've created for our students, which calculates things like planning costs. So in this situation, I've assumed a detailed application for 6 units, so sites up to 50 units, and that will automatically calculate what the planning application fee is. So that's why that one seems weirdly specific compared to all of the others. Now, obviously, if you have a quote, then you would put your quoted figure in, and as you go through your deal and you prepare to submit this to the bank and you do have quotes, that's when you would then of course replace these estimates with the actual figures. At this stage, we're assuming we've only just perhaps received contact back from the landowner to say they're interested in selling. So we're doing our first appraisal. We haven't got any quotes on this site. So we're using our industry knowledge here to implement numbers that we anticipate would be around the right figure. So the topographical survey may end up being £1,100 or £1,250, a little bit over what we estimated, but £50 isn't going to break the appraisal. What will break the appraisal is completely forgetting massive elements of costs, if that makes sense. So that's the planning section. I've also just I've gone on to a local CIL authority to me just to get a CIL number. So our CIL is our community infrastructure levy, and that is £85 per metre square of new development. This site, I'm assuming, is a blank field, nothing on it. Therefore, there's no demolition. So all of the floor area is net additional. So that's where we have £104,000 of contributions for our CIL. Again, it's a flat site. So in terms of abnormals, at this stage, we're assuming nothing overly abnormal. I would have done checks for things like Japanese knotweed or other invasive plants, and I would have also had a look back at the historic uses of this site to maybe get an indication as to whether or not there could be any contamination or issues with the land. And the assumption is that it's not, it's just a bit overgrown. So a bit of site clearance work for £25,000. Importantly, we now get into our build cost. I've assumed we're probably a little bit, let's say, down south if we're hitting £400 a square foot, maybe, I can't think of an area off my head right now. But I'm assuming we're going to have to build to a nice specification in order to achieve that. So I've put in a build cost of £190 per square foot, just based on, where I know build costs are at the minute. Of course, if you were unaware of build costs, you could approach your professional teams. If you're a part of Property Ed, then you would use the costing calculator, which data scrapes all the costings across the country. You would use the resources available to you in order to get a build cost. Now, on this point, one thing I always recommend to students, be hyper focused when it comes to searching for sites. And the reason for that is, one, you get better at looking for sites. If you're scattergun approaching everywhere and not homing in on a niche, you will just spot the very obvious opportunities and you will miss so many other opportunities because you're not really burrowing into that area. But the other benefit of focusing on one, let's say, local authority, is you get a better understanding of the costs in that area. So you would get a better idea of what the build costs are, for example. So when it comes to doing these appraisals, you're able to do them with a lot more confidence, but also a lot quicker, because you haven't got to go calling around everyone in order to find out, how much is it going to cost me to build in this area, because it's completely new to me. So I've settled on £190 per square foot in this instance, plus a 10% contingency. Now, some people will say this is maybe a little bit high. I don't think so. Banks are wanting this at the minute. Also, we're in, quite an uncertain market with build costs and things. So I don't think 10% is particularly unreasonable on a project like this. We then get into our fees. So we've got 1.2% on construction value for the architect. We've got 1% for the engineer. Our EA, our employer's agent, who will encompass the role of things like quantity surveyor, CDM coordination. They're at 2%. We've got NHBC/Premier Registration. That's your warranty provider. So my recommendation is always go with an A-rated provider, but it could be anyone. So that's £3,000 because, like I say, I go with A-rated, so they're a bit more expensive. It's just a recommendation. Building regs and then project management. That is the fee that you as a developer would be taking throughout the build. We then have the cost of exit. So this is things like show home fit out, estate agency fee, advertising. Again, there's some sections I leave blank, some sections I put in a cost, just because I do want to show consideration for those things. And then most importantly, we then get to the land acquisition section. So this is what I really want to talk about in today's video is, how do we get to whatever figure it might be that, we want to offer on that land. So initially, I don't even look at funding costs, because if it doesn't work pre-funding, it won't work when funding costs get involved. So personally, I always look at the pre-finance margin before I look at anything else. So this is this number here, and at the minute, based on all the costs in the deal with zero land value, we're at a 37% margin, which is obviously amazing. So now we need to figure out, what is the residual land value of this site once planning is achieved. That's step one in figuring out what you're going to offer. So essentially, no real magic tool here. You're going to keep changing the land value until you hit a pre-finance margin of, now different people will say a different number, anywhere from 20 to 23%. 20 is cusp of viability. Personally, I teach 23 because that opens up all the lenders to you in terms of you're not restricting your lending panel based on not hitting their criteria. So personally, I work to 23. You will hear other people say 22, 21 or 20. But again, sort of a personal preference there. So let's just put in, for example, 600,000 pounds. We're at 26%, 750. Oh, not 75,000. That would be nice and cheap. 20. Yeah. Okay. So 750,000 pounds leaves me with 23% margin. So that is the absolute maximum you should be paying for this site. The reason being that is the open market value of that site. So if you're paying more than that, why would you be taking it through planning? Why would you be taking on the risk? Personally, I wouldn't even be paying that much, because if I'm paying open market value, then, personally, I want a reward for that as well, because there is, of course, risk in the planning process. So to not receive an upside for the capital that you put into that, to me, doesn't really make sense. But this is your absolute benchmark. So once we have 750 in mind, the next question is, okay, where do we go from here? So personally, my next step is to look at, well, how much did I spend on planning? £50,000. Let's just round it up to that. Okay, so at least the cost of planning has to come off of the purchase price. So that now brings us down to £700,000. We're now at a 24% margin. However, I wouldn't be happy with that, because I'm just getting my costs back for risk. Because remember, if we don't get planning approved for whatever reason, we don't get our money back. That would be money gone in the wind. So personally, if I'm going to be putting the money in at risk, I want a reward for that. Otherwise, I'll just go buy a site that's already got planning without the risk. My absolute minimum baseline is I want my planning costs again. So that would bring £650,000 as my new total that I would offer on this site. And for me personally, I wouldn't want to go a penny above that, because that's just sort of my position when it comes to offering on sites without planning. I want to earn what I spent at planning back again. And, for me, that's a reasonable reward. Obviously, I would like more than that. The higher the margin, the better. Personally, I really start to get excited about sites without planning when I'm hitting about a 27% margin. So let's just see what that number would be. Let's go 500. Okay, yeah, so £500,000 is the point at which I start hitting a 27% margin, which for me as a developer is when I start to get really interested in a deal, because you've then got a lot of scope for movement up and down with things like bill costs, but also the banks are really happy to see this, of course, because it's a more secure site. So that's from a developer intro perspective on how I would offer, what am I wanting out of the deal? But one thing that you see a lot, and it's very easy, I understand why it happens, is let's say you have a meeting with a landowner and the landowner says, yeah, I've been offered £1 million for this land 3 years ago by another developer. So I want at least £1 million, but the market's gone up. So I probably want 1.5 now. So you're like, oh, okay, I've got £1.5 million that I need to reach and I'm at £500,000. Well, then a lot of people will think, how can I keep stretching the appraisal in order to reach £1.5 million? So they'll start bumping up the GDV, perhaps to the right upper end of what that market can withstand, which may not be realistic for the product that you're going to be delivering. But they'll also drop the build costs, which of course means you're going to be building to perhaps a lower quality, which means achieving that high GDV becomes even more unlikely. And they're doing this to try and squeeze more money out of the deal. in order to reach that million or million and a half that the landowner's batted around. And it's really easy to do that because you think it's a good site, I really want to do it, I want to come to an agreement. And it's very easy then to lose that that objective view. Your emotions get involved, you get carried away, and you're trying to achieve someone else's aspirations. And that is an absolute no-no in my books. You can never let emotions get in the way of the way you appraise a site, regardless of what the architect has said, what your auntie at the pub has said, what the landowner said, what the landowner's children say. It does not matter. Even a land agent, what they say does not matter. You have to appraise in the way that makes you comfortable, which means a GDV you can comfortably support, build costs that you know are comfortably achievable, and allowances for all the things that need to be allowed for in the deal. And then once you've got all of your costs and GDV in correctly, you then need to be working to margins, that are, comfortable and achievable, which, as mentioned, if you're buying a site with planning, should be, in my opinion, 23%. And if it's without planning, well, that's when you need to decide what are you comfortable with in terms of the margin. For me, I like 27. Appraisals are our tool that we as developers and banks, valuers, use in order to determine the value of the land. And that is derived from the GDV and the costs associated with that deal, not what the landowner wants ultimately. Now, these two things may not align, and that's when you would start looking at, well, option one is you just say, okay, not for me at this time, move on to the next deal. Or if you're still very adamant in doing this deal, that's when you start looking at more creative deal structures. And of course, I can do videos on these if you guys would like. That's where you could look at offering things like a joint venture, for example, where the landowner was to put the land in and receive a higher uplift on the back end in the form of a profit share. Or it could just be a straight, delayed payment where they get a percentage of the profit, which will bump up their land value, so to speak. But the day one purchase price still is at a number that works for the appraisal. Knowing when to walk away because the numbers aren't working for you is just as important as knowing how to actually run an appraisal. Listening to that appraisal after you've done it sometimes isn't all that easy, but the numbers in there don't lie compared to, following emotions, let's say. So that is personally how I approach appraising sites. So hopefully you guys found that video useful as to how I go about appraising and my thought process behind an appraisal. If there's any of the topics that you guys would like to see me cover, drop a comment below and I will try and cover as many as possible. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and I will see you all soon.